scale unprecedented since the extinction of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, and it's happening incredibly quickly and continuing to accelerate. In 1991, one salmon species was endangered. Today, it's 14. Countless insect species are already gone for good. A WWF study says that in the past 50 years, the abundance of global wildlife has collapsed by 69%, with the worst effects being seen in Latin America, where abundance has fallen by 94% since 1970. According to a number of studies, the current rate of extinction is between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the pre-human background rate. And that should give you a clue as to what's driving this crisis. To anyone paying attention, it's pretty clear why we're experiencing a sixth mass extinction. It's easy to say that humans are a blight, or we've overpopulated the Earth, or some other vague condemnation of our species as a whole. But that's not the problem. There's plenty of room for all of us. There's plenty of food for all of us. The Earth isn't overburdened. And anyone who claims otherwise is either misguided or trying to sell you on some Malthusian worldview. The problem is that since the Industrial Revolution, the world's dominant economic system has been built on the core principles of extraction, accumulation, profit maximization, and endless growth. It stands to reason that if the profit motive is the sole determinant of the path society takes, any number of crimes against our environment can be waved off as necessary sacrifices. Take logging, for example. When managed sustainably, trees are a renewable resource. They just take time to grow. A common sense system would ensure that we don't chop down more trees than we can replace over a given period. But that, of course, doesn't take into account the fact that we could generate more money and produce more stuff if we do keep chopping the trees. The Amazon rainforest is one of the planet's most crucial carbon sinks. A carbon sink is something that absorbs more carbon from the atmosphere than it produces. These are incredibly valuable resources, and critical to sustaining most life on Earth. In recent decades, thanks to deforestation and human-caused climate change, the Amazon is nearing what's called a dieback loop. Since the rainforest creates and relies on its own rainfall, when trees are killed by logging or wildfire, it becomes harder to maintain that fragile equilibrium. At some point, the Amazon will begin to fail, and as it fails, more trees will die, and as they die, the process will accelerate, and eventually, what was once the most vibrant expanse of plant life on Earth will be dry, desolate savanna. That's a dieback loop, and we're actively shooting ourselves in the foot by carving up the lungs of the planet for the sake of greater capital accumulation. Now, the Amazon dying off is a big picture problem, but if we zoom in a little bit, we can see where the current extinctions come into play. Habitat destruction is a major cause of the eradication of animal life on Earth. Humans have taken over 70% of the planet's land, as well as 75% of its freshwater resources. If we were just making use of those resources and living sustainably within these ecosystems, it would be fine. But the problem is, we bulldoze them, or strip them bare, or poison the water supply with industrial waste, or put up walls that block key migration paths, or kill any animals larger than a house cat because they're seen as a danger to humans. But you might be thinking, animals, right? Yeah, it's sad that some cool animals are going extinct, but at the end of the day, it's important. Let me introduce you to what's called a keystone species. This is a gray wolf. Back in the 1930s, these majestic creatures were killed off in Yellowstone National Park. For the next 70 years, the deer and elk populations in the park exploded, straining the area's carrying capacity. What's more, without the wolves as a threat, the elk didn't feel the need to move around as much, and decimated the local plant population with their incessant grazing. This, in turn, damaged the beaver population, which relied on willow to survive through the winter. This continued on down the food chain. With the removal of one species, the entire ecosystem began to collapse. In 1995, gray wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, and what's happened since then has been nothing short of incredible. With the wolves back, elk had to be more mobile, moving around to avoid the predators. This allowed the local flora to recover, with once bare hillsides now covered with trees and shrubs. With the trees came the birds, songbirds and ravens and eagles. The willows recovered, which provided food for the beavers. The wolves also acted as food distributors, leaving carrion for countless species, such as ravens, crows, eagles, magpies, coyotes, foxes, and bears. They killed coyotes, which allowed rabbits, mice, badgers, and other smaller animals to recover. The mice and rabbits brought ever more birds of prey. Before the wolves came back, there was just one group of beavers left in the park. Today, there are 9 beaver colonies. But it didn't stop there. Time is work. The beavers spread and built dams, which had multiple effects. They tamed the seasonal runoff, created pools to store water to recharge the water tables, and provided shaded areas for fish and aquatic ecosystems for otters and muskrats. But most incredibly of all, the behavior of the rivers themselves responded to the rules. With the ecosystem stabilized and the trees growing back, there was less erosion of the banks. The rivers flowed straighter and narrower, more pools formed, and all of this in turn reinforced the strength of the new wildlife by providing habitats for the many diverse species of the park. All of this, down to the very geography of the park, was revitalized by the presence of one single species. That's why gray wolves and certain other animals are considered keystone species, because without them, entire ecosystems fall apart. Now think about what it means that we're on track to eradicate over 75% of animal species on Earth. How many of those will be keystone species? How many that we don't even know are keystone species yet? But maybe it's still not enough. Maybe you still feel like it doesn't really matter, that we're insulated from the collapse. It may be hard to hear, but we are very much a part of this biosphere. We don't get to exist outside and above the rest of life on Earth. We are entirely dependent on it for our survival. Let's consider another factor in the mass extinction: climate change. Beginning with the Industrial Revolution, humans have pumped ever more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, drastically accelerating the warming of the planet. Back in the 70s, Exxon, yes, that Exxon, the fossil fuel giant, conducted the world's truly comprehensive study into the effects of climate change. Their results were shocking and surprisingly accurate. They determined that their activity and that of the rest of the oil and gas industry would directly contribute to unsafe levels of warming, which would have untold negative effects on life. In a just world, they would have revealed their findings. But as a capitalist firm, under a capitalist system, they followed the prime directive, the profit motive. And instead of revealing their findings, they buried them and launched the most comprehensive corporate propaganda campaign in modern history. The rest you've heard before. If we don't cap warming at 1.5 degrees, we're in for a bad time. It'll accelerate the dieback loop of the Amazon. The oceans will become increasingly uninhabitable. We'll face more frequent and devastating weather events, including droughts, hurricanes, wildfires, and monsoons. And entire regions of the planet will become too hot to safely sustain human populations. But what I really want to stress about this is how it will affect our food supply. Remember how I said we rely on the rest of the animals on the planet? Let's start with fish. Like the Amazon, the world's oceans are a crucial carbon sink. Since we began tracking it in the 1970s, oceans have absorbed 93% of the world's excess heat generated by greenhouse gas emissions. This has contributed to a rapidly warming aquatic environment. They've also become starkly more acidic and contain less oxygen. The ocean is home to somewhere between 500,000 and 10 million distinct species, a massive chunk of the planet's biodiversity, on a scale that would make Yellowstone blush. As of right now, the oceans are expected to warm by up to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That's a whole lot more than the 1.5 degrees where we'd already be having a bad time. So what does that look like? By 2050, the tropics will see a decrease of 40% in their seafood catch. Shrimp could lose 70% of their habitat to warming waters in the Gulf of Mexico. From 2014 to 2016, Pacific cod populations decreased by 70% in the Gulf of Alaska. Entire fishing communities are no longer able to sustain themselves by catching salmon. Fisheries have closed. Coastal towns have enacted strict fishing restrictions where once there was no need. And low-income countries that are heavily dependent on seafood are being disproportionately affected by the climate fallout that is mostly the fault of industrialized nations. And it's not just fish. Food crops are at risk as well. Everything from staples like maize and corn to luxuries like cocoa and coffee are also in the crosshairs. The Yellowstone example should demonstrate just how interconnected the planet's ecosystems are. Plants, animals, even the terrain itself relies on a fragile equilibrium to thrive. But don't take any of this from me. The world scientists are in agreement. To quote a 2022 IPCC report, climate change will increasingly put pressure on food production and access, especially in vulnerable regions, undermining food security and nutrition. The capitalist tendencies of overproduction, waste, and hyperconsumerism are only making these problems worse. Consumption drives extraction. Extraction drives exploitation. Exploitation maintains poverty and suffering. The myth that capitalism will one day magically provide this wasteful first world quality of life for everyone is just that, a myth. And even if it did, the Earth couldn't sustain it. Studies on global consumption suggest that in order to maintain a hyper-consuming Western lifestyle for every person on the planet, we need the resources of 5 Earths. This is why people say we cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the planet itself will be fine. That's not going anywhere. It's our own survival and the existence of countless amazing and often critical species that we're putting at risk. The 5 past mass extinctions all happened well before humans came onto the scene. They were natural. A massive asteroid, for example, or increased volcanic activity. The extinction we face today is of our own making. We have the data. We know what's causing this. And we know what economic system relies on causing these problems of extraction, overconsumption, and endless growth. If we want to stop the dying, the destruction of life as it has existed for the last 60 million years, we must dismantle capitalism. Even the scientists who are so afraid to say that capitalism is the problem recognize that this system cannot and will not solve the problems it creates.
I know there's no political will to do any of the things that I'm concerned with, which is exactly why I and the vast majority of my colleagues think we've had it, that the next few decades will be the end of the kind of civilization we're used to.
Throughout history, massive systemic change has always seemed impossible until suddenly it wasn't. As Ursula Le Guin said, "We live under capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings." Socialist revolution remains the only way to build a world that is sustainable and just. A world that rely on the destruction of the only home our species has ever had. We've known this for over a century, and the capitalist powers have crushed that possibility every time. Through coups, invasions, sabotage, assassinations, whatever it takes to keep the average person from realizing that there is a better alternative. I remember when I was a kid on a warm night, my family would all go outside and we'd try to catch fireflies. It was one of the most magical things to see, all these tiny twinkling lights floating all around you. And you catch one and you look at it and you think, wow, how does something like this exist? A couple decades later, and I have a 1-year-old daughter. She's going to grow up without ever seeing a sight like that. It's the little things like this that make you stop and think. The clock is ticking. Socialism or extinction? Which side are you on? Hey there. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that I recently launched a new channel. It's hard to believe, but for the past 10 years now, I've made my living as a creative professional. Over that time, I've picked up a lot of useful tips and tricks, and now I'd like to share them with the next generation of creators. This new channel is dedicated not only to teaching others how to make a career out of working creatively, but also to sharing some general musings on living a creative life. I'm really excited for this project, and I hope I can make a difference to anyone out there who wants to do what I do, but doesn't know where to start. So if you're interested in YouTube, or podcast, or documentary work, or just want a little peek behind the scenes, consider subscribing. I've got 3 videos out already, and the 4th episode is coming next Friday. I'm going to stagger the releases of Second Thought and this new channel so that you've always got something to watch Friday mornings at 9 a.m. Central Time. As always, thanks for watching. Drop a thumbs up if you liked the episode, thumbs down if you hated it, and I'll see you in the next one. To justify imposing more exploitation on them and on ourselves. It would probably help if I ran very quickly through the history of where this idea comes from. Let's do that.
I love you.
Laziness, being idle in a morally corrupt way, starts with the Reformation and chattel slavery. See, one of the ways chattel slavery was justified in the US was through the idea of the Protestant work ethic. Slaves were obviously exploited, and this made a lot of non-enslaved people uncomfortable. But to reassure them that it was okay, A myth was created that without being forced to work, slaves would otherwise be idle, slothful, or ding ding ding, lazy. And because, in parallel, Protestants had just made up the idea that hard work and accumulating a lot of wealth was proof you'd go to heaven, they felt good, or at least
viennent plus. Change simplement de vie. Ça paraît un peu simple de dire ça comme ça, mais tu sais, si tu es...
Kill yourself. There.
I'm Julia Manchester. What's America thinking? Well, this week it's been a lot of fear and concern around immigration. From the ultimate
your
death
face
of the
is so
bipartisan
punchable.
border deal to a shocking act of violence caught on camera in Times Square. Reporting on this story from Next Star Nation.
I'll be back in a
WCIS
second.
in New
Put my
York,
car in the driveway.
Anthony D.
Je vais mettre mon auto dans le driveway là.
All 5 of the suspects have been set free. Now, some are
I
asking
try really hard.
living in migrant shelters should be
Fuck
living in the
myself.
country at all. A chorus of outrage growing from video of this shocking beatdown on NYPD cops in Times Square.
Took a swing at my lieutenant, hit him in the head. They fell to the floor, and then it just became a pile-on, a melee.
Politicians and police decrying the 8 persons who attacked, leaving a lieutenant and officers laying in bruise.
Reprehensible. Cowards. I'm disgusted by what I saw.
Mayor Adams breaking his silence exclusively on Pix 11 about the Saturday shellacking allegedly perpetrated by a group of men the NYPD classifies as migrants, causing a disturbance.
Those who are breaking our laws, we need to re-examine the laws that don't allow us to deport them.
New York does not have the power to deport criminals, only the feds do. But there's a bipartisan bid to change removal rules. Staten Island Congresswoman Nicole Milliotakis saying migrants who commit crimes here should be deported immediately and have any future immigration application denied. Governor Hochul said it's worth looking into.
If someone commits a crime against a police officer in the state of New York, and they're not, they're not processed, they're not here legally, definitely worth checking into.
Migrant advocates say the few committing crimes need better outlets.
Getting case managers, social workers, mental health therapists. We will see more outreach being done.
The NYPD further enraged by the leniency of the judge who set loose the 5 men arrested.
There's no consequences. We must change this. End of story.
And Anthony DiLorenzo joins us now. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you.
So we know officials are outraged, but how are New Yorkers responding to the attack?
We've been speaking with people throughout the past 2 weeks now almost, and the migrant crisis really is something that has consumed New Yorkers. It's something that they are hearing about all the time, particularly because of the cost to the city. And this obviously is painting migrants in a bad light. And the mayor wants to go ahead and make sure that people know that this is just a small minority of people. 175,000 asylum seekers have arrived in the city, and we're talking about, in this case, 10 people. So for the most part, people who we've spoken with aren't really concerned that this is going to become part of a larger trend. However, if this were not such a heavily Democratic city, you might think that it would be a little different elsewhere.
Right. And as you mentioned, you've been covering this story. Why did the New York District Attorney's Office ultimately decide to release some of the suspects without a bail?
There were 4 that were released on their own recognizance. So basically, the DA looked at the evidence that they had at the time after this Saturday attack, and they really only had a short piece of video, maybe 2 minutes, that they looked at. And it was hard to identify all of these suspects because we are told that they actually switched clothing after the attack. So they see them on video, but then after it finished, some of them walked away and changed their clothing. So they wanted to make sure that they had the right people identified for the right crimes. And some of the offenses, 4 of them, they determined they should not ask for bail. Ultimately let them out. However, 1 was remanded to Rikers Island. He was just indicted yesterday, and we are likely going to see a lot of movement in this case within the next 24 hours.
And are there any updates on the whereabouts of those suspects who reportedly fled New York after being released?
So they did hop on the bus, so we know that, and they reportedly got on the bus. Someone paid for the ticket. There was some speculation yesterday that they were found by Border Patrol in Phoenix, Arizona. after some back and forth again, they were trying to identify who these people were that they had in custody. Ultimately, they determined these were not any of the suspects from this case. And you point out, as the DA points out, that they're really allowed to go wherever they are because they have been released on their own recognizance. One of them is under supervised release, and we are told by the DA that he had checked in at one point. So they just have to be back here in the city for their arraignment, which is scheduled for March 4th, if not sooner.
So what can you tell us about the suspects who had already been arrested for prior crimes committed since coming to America?
Well, we're told by the NYPD that a lot of the people who are suspected in the beatdown of the two cops are part of a Venezuelan gang. So they are now concerned that that gang is spreading its tentacles into the United States and here in New York, and they are committing offenses according to the NYPD, stabbing, shoplifting. You saw what happened in this video, obviously, and they're even looking at now some human trafficking patterns starting to emerge. So definitely something that they're keeping a close watch on. They have police outside a lot of the shelters, and that's exactly what the police were doing on that Saturday night, making sure that everything was safe, that everyone was acting orderly, and that's ultimately what touched off this whole deal with the cops because they were doing their patrols to be sure that all the people there were acting within the law.
So in terms of those police who were doing their job that night, how are they doing since being injured?
So they didn't suffer major injuries, rather. The police unions are saying that they are ultimately going to be okay, suffered some shoulder pain, bumps and bruises. You saw how they were kicked and punched and thrown to the ground. So these injuries associated with
but you're like, may you consider what makes them want to do that to you?
We created the best currency the world has ever known. Okay, big opening statement. Let me back it up. We've made a currency backed by real physical gold and silver that can be used in 150 countries across the world. Just like regular money, only we've done it better. Gold protects your spending from inflation. It's the most stable currency ever known. It's kept its value for thousands of years. While the on the other hand, well, it's not looking so great. Now that the Kinesis virtual card lets you spend your gold and silver in real time, it's free of conversion. Everyone can use real money real easy. We take care of all the boring stuff like bolting, insurance, and storage fees, leaving you to enjoy all the benefits. With Sky High, you can spend an extra $50,000 in peace of mind transacting with MasterCard. We're tired of money that does nothing for you. That's why we give back over half of our transaction fees globally every month. So every time you spend with Kinesis, you earn. Exit crypto markets into the security of physical gold, or even use the crypto as currency with split-second conversion and 100% control over your assets. At all times, the Kinesis virtual card. The power is in your hands.
Most people have no clue that in 2024, the best way to make money with e-commerce is not dropshipping from China or selling on Shopify. Home delivery times, low margins, communication issues, no thanks to it. It's definitely not Amazon FBA. There's some upfront inventory, long storage fees, competition from Amazon themselves. Absolutely not. No way. Forget about selling ebooks or audiobooks. You never last for the months. They're a huge waste of time. That's where you come to build a sustainable little known model that has all these advantages of dropshipping and FBA that's designed to it's called AI e-com business. Using this business model, don't worry about dropshipping from China or long shipping times. And on top of that, you don't need to buy inventory first. You don't have to pay the storage fees. In fact, you only pay the product after you sell the items and you get money in your pocket.
Well, Curious
So
game.
like Amazon FBA, there are no sunk costs and that's why the risk is really low. You don't need a lot of money to start, and yet you make huge margins of over 50%. That's how our 250 made 6 figures in just 1 month. You won't need any prior experience. David was a business e-com, but he made $3,000 in just 1 month. Michael to 2 hours a day for you to work on your skills and should make additional hundreds or thousands of dollars every month. Want to know more about this AI business model? Just click on the link below this video for more information. Hi, by the way, my name is Jeff Vander, multiple seven-figure ecom business owner, co-founder and CEO of Scale and Ecom Education Company. Over the past 6 years, we've been helping business owners to grow their income stores from 5 figures or more in as little as a few days. We personally scaled our ecom business.
So we've been watching migrants being bused and flown to for months now. Have you, from your perspective, seen a shift in sentiment on immigration since the influx of migrants arrived in the city?
I think this really was a pivotal moment for the sentiment. You have a lot of people who are sympathetic to the migrants and the asylum seekers here in New York City, but some people who were sympathetic to them before now are starting to rethink what exactly is happening, especially after
immigrants. This is the government.
After what happened in Times Square. That is certainly anger and a point that is causing a lot of fire among people in the city that the DA let these people out. And it seems now that he is possibly trying to, I guess, a PR boost, really. He spoke out last week, and we expect to hear from him again to try and calm some of the anger that people are feeling here in the city. So it's definitely been a point of aggravation for some people.
Absolutely, and New York City Mayor Eric Adams addressed the state legislature on Tuesday. What changes you see now in the
Well, he doesn't want to sit down with the city council to talk about whether they need to review the sanctuary city law that was put in place back in 2014, so it's about a decade old now. And ultimately, the mayor says he would like to see anyone who's accused of committing a violent, dangerous felony in the city to face deportation. And he wants the NYPD to start to be able to work with ICE and cases like that. That has drawn a lot of criticism from immigration advocates. So it doesn't seem like appetite on the city hall to really change the current law. So if the mayor says to do so within the law, he could possibly sign an executive order to change what he wants. And right now, he's sort of been at odds with the city council over some policing laws. So it'll be interesting how that all plays out. Probably.
the story is really emblematic of how the immigration situation or story nationally is happening in many of our own communities. Anthony DeLorenzo, thank you so much for breaking it down for us.
You're welcome.
There's so much going on with immigration in this country. Here to take a broader look at what's happening across the nation is Amy K. Dacey, Executive Director of the Stein Institute of Policy and Politics at American University. Amy, it's so great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so Amy, just to kick it off, you've seen the footage of that attack on NYPD officers in New York City. How do incidents like that influence feelings about immigration as a whole?
Well, I think incidents like we saw in New York certainly make people aware that this is not, immigration is not just issues that happen along the border. A lot of challenges with immigration are seen in these sanctuary cities. Nobody wants to see violence, and certainly against our public servants. So it was hard to see, but it also helps to reiterate that immigration is a national issue, and there's a lot happening in communities across the country.
Supercharge your business with the all-new Shopify point of sale, the all-in-one POS solution built on the world's most powerful commerce platform. Whether you have one location or 1,000, your team can sell their best with Shopify POS. Sign up for a free trial today.
Are you a professional looking to immigrate legally to the
No.
United States? Today we're going to talk about one of the best options to apply directly to a U.S. permanent residency, a green card, via the EB2 National Interest Waiver. I'm attorney Carlos Colombo, and today we're going to be discussing what are the advantages of applying under the EB2 National Interest Waiver, and what are the requirements that you require for this trade-off. The EB2 National Interest Waiver changed dramatically in 2017, opening a way for people to immigrate directly as a green card holder without the need of filing a fine. That is one of the best advantages of the EB2. So let's talk about that. Number one, typically, for you to obtain a green card, you either need a family member or something that is willing to sponsor you. The EBC National Interest Waiver does not require that you have a U.S. sponsoring company that petitions for your green card. So that's advantage number one. Advantage number two of the EBC National Interest Waiver is that you don't need to invest. Your investor visa, but the EBC relies solely on
No! Son of a bitch!
and number three,
Cunt,
is a much
sucker.
faster way for most to immigrate legally as a green card holder. Most applications for green card sponsorship take 2 years or longer. The EB2 is a much shorter way. And finally, of course, you as a professional, your spouse, and your children under 21 will all obtain a green card through this process.
Wow.
I will encourage you to share in the link below your curriculum, your resume. We can do a free analysis of your profile.
So as we're seeing, these stories play out in communities across the country, there's also this overarching story of the 2024 presidential election on Capitol Hill. You have efforts to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary, as well as efforts to try to get some sort of immigration reform passed. Not sure what that's going to look like going forward, but are these stories that we see coming out of New York City being weaponized politically?
I think there's been a significant amount of politicization around the immigration issue. I mean, you haven't seen major reforms since 1996, and a lot of that is because you haven't seen the two parties be able to come together to really address some of these challenges that we're seeing and can be addressed. It's an election year. I think that both parties try to find ways to figure out what are the biggest vulnerabilities for their opponents, where are the challenges that they're facing, and what's on Americans' minds. And I think what we've seen in exit polls from some of the early Republican primaries, what you've also seen in recent polling is that immigration is not just on the minds of people in states like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and along the border, but it's certainly mindful in a lot of these places across the country. And even in like a special election in New York, it seems to be playing a major part of the messaging.
Well, in New York, we saw Mayor Eric Adams address the state legislature on potential changes to sanctuary cities like New York. Here's what he said, and then I want to get your reaction.
My legal team tells me I have the authority to have cooperation with ICE for those who
Actual bug. Fuck's sake.
Okay, we're gonna go pee.
Come on, puppy. Ew, you just sneezed on my leg.
That's gross.
Like a lot of debris.
Lots of debris. Debris.
Come on, go pee. Come. Please. Okay.
Sorry. Sorry.
Do, 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 do.
Come.
Do, 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 do. That's Venga Boys, isn't it? We like to party.
Open. Who's gonna walk?
Go pee. I see you. Where is he? What? Pick up. Ouch.